Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Florida Friendly Landscaping Homeowner webinar. We are going to get started today with a little question since our topic is wetlands. I want to know, what is your favorite experience that you've had in a wetland, and whether that's boating or hiking or wildlife viewing or botanizing. I'll start with mine. This was years ago. This is probably like 10 years ago. And my husband and I went hiking through the Apalachicola National Forest in the Panhandle. And we were following the Florida Trail. And then, boy, did that trail just disappear into a swamp. And all of the all of the trailblazers were like on cypress trees. So I was like, well, they knew what they were doing. They were not avoiding the swamp. They just took us right through it. So that was one of my favorite experiences, was just like a big wet hike and camping and coming back. So, all right, let's see. We got kayaking for me anywhere. That's from Gail. Ooh, kayak. Well, okay, well, guys, tell me about your wetlands, though. Yeah, we like kayaking, but which wetlands are we going in here? All right, photography in Everglades National Park and a bike ride around Shark Valley Loop. Ooh, orchids in the Factahatchee. I've never been down there. It sounds really awesome. Okay, we got kayaking at Weeki Wachee Springs and Juniper Springs. Boy, if you can get on that Juniper Springs run to go kayaking, that is one of the most special boating experiences in Florida. So cool. Linda says she likes seeing manatees, also a very special Florida thing. Can't do that anywhere else. Oh, cool. Okay, eagle viewing at Pine Island and the manatees at Crystal River. All right, we got an airboater to view wildlife. Okay, and we got a lot of people who are out viewing wildlife and looking at flowers. Love it, guys. Oh, cool. Oh, okay. I haven't heard of this one. Ocala Recharge Park, artificial wetlands from an old golf course. Hey, we had one of those in Gainesville too. We took an old canal that used to dump all of our runoff into a sinkhole in Gainesville, and we turned it into a wetlands park that filters the water before it goes down to the aquifer. So that's pretty cool. I'll have to check that out in Ocala sometime. Okay, near Tampa, Steve likes to go hiking on Honeymoon Island. Okay, I gotta like make some notes here. I hope everybody's taking notes of where they're gonna go hiking next or kayaking next. Okay, there is a newly opened Lagoon Greenway, and we got there at 9 a.m. to see all of the oaks full of opened resurrection ferns and Spanish moss and sundogs. It was beautiful. That sounds awesome. All right, well, I'm so glad to see that we have a lot of people out in Florida appreciating our wetlands, since they're such an integral part of our environment here. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. So hello, welcome to Florida Friendly Landscaping Homeowner Webinar. This is a series that happens every third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. And I'm Claire Mitchell, and I am the statewide education manager here in the FFL state office. And today we have Calvin Gardner, who will speak with us today about the story of Florida's wetlands. So everyone's mic has been muted. And if you have any questions, we're going to put these in the Q&A box, and that's down at the bottom here. And the chat box is going to be closed pretty soon. And so if you have any questions, put them in that Q&A box. We're going to answer all our questions at the end of the presentation. And then we have an exit survey at the end of the presentation as well. So please stick around for that. And that helps us choose the topics that you like, the speakers that you like, and it lets us know how we're doing. Our next webinar will be November 18th at 11 a.m. and we'll be joined by Teresa Badarek. She is the Urban Horticulture Extension Agent at Pinellas County, and she'll be talking about biophilia. But today we're talking with Calvin Gardner. He is the Urban Residential Horticulture Extension Agent with IFAS Extension in Orange County. So in this role, he educates the community on sustainable horticultural practices, including community gardening techniques and the care of both indoor and outdoor plants. His efforts aim to promote environmentally friendly gardening and enhance urban green spaces within the county. So Calvin, thank you so much, and take it away.
Hello, how y'all doing today? Can you hear me? Okay, thumbs up, perfect. Alrighty, sorry, my internet connection's a little funny. I'm actually out at a conference right now. a very fun conference that is the International Symposium on Underutilized Plant Species. So we get to meet with a bunch of professionals around the world. It's put on by the International Society of Horticulture, and we get to learn about all the different crops that may grow super well in places and pockets around the world. But we get to learn about them here and maybe implement them in systems and maybe use some of our own crops to help other places around the world that might be struggling in agriculture right now. So it's been eye-opening. It's amazing. And I'm currently in Fort Myers when I'm typically based out of Orlando, Florida, Orange County. Um, yeah, thank you guys for being here today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about something that is very near and dear to me, which is the stories of Florida's wetlands. So, I myself am a seventh generation Floridian. So, my whole family's from Florida. My family's family is from Florida. Florida is just a part of our life. And so, we well, we've always grown up. My family's rooted in all sorts of areas around Florida. Funny enough, a lot of my family is rooted around this area that I'm currently in Fort Myers. We had a 120-year-old fishing cabin based out of Sanibel, Florida, that I grew up going to my whole life, and Hurricane Ian took that one, and that was pretty hard. But we're rebuilding, which is nice. It's always nice to get a much bigger house after a hurricane. But so my great grandfather had built out on Sanibel, and a lot of my family has a good chunk of history along this eastern coast of Florida, where you kind of have this Sanibel area that meets all the way down to the Everglades. I've spent a lot of time in the Everglades with my family, and have some family who live down there. I have some family who were running from the law and knew how to live in the Everglades. And so they had spent a lot of time in the Everglades because, from their words, they say the food was much better uh, in the Everglades than it was in prison. So they decided to spend time in the Everglades. Um, yeah, so I just have a lot of good, rich family history that I love Florida, and something about Florida is and we'll get into this as an overarching theme, is that many of us might be multi-generational like myself. Many of us might have just moved here, and really at the end of the day, we're all very similar. Florida is Florida, and all of us have moved here for good weather and good fishing. And we'll talk about how that actually is historically why people have come here, and why it's an amazing place, and why it's it's always been a state that has always had open arms, and always had people come to visit. And the only caveat is that as we come and move to Florida, that we have this kind of mutual respect for what Florida is and what it's comprised of. And wetlands is such a huge, wonderful part of that. Just the idea of wetlands and how they operate and how we get into it is going to be it's just fascinating. And so we are going to dive into that. And throughout this presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I will likely get to them at the very end of this presentation. So I'm going to do it. My favorite thing is I'm going to talk at a camera, and I only see myself. And I'm going to hope you guys are listening on the other end. And I'm so excited to be sharing this. Now, this presentation is not without um, its uh, you know, res where the research has been done and the respect that it need to be paid for that, which is the Orange County History Center. It is so worth visiting if you get the chance. It is based in downtown Orlando. It is this beautiful old building. It used to be the old courthouse, and it is full of history. It looks like it should be the Orlando Regional History Center, but it's actually owned by the county in the middle of Orlando. But it's wonderful. And if you go to the very top story, it kind of works its way down as you move through it. You get to this like you start out and like all the archaeological digs that happened in Florida and who did them all. And it's just a really cool trek. And then they move you through the whole regional history of Florida. And so if you are a Florida history buff, go there. And if you are a real history buff, go talk to the people who are working in those exhibits because they really know their stuff. And that's where I got a lot of this information from, was I had them walk me through all these exhibits of kind of the anthropological progression through Florida's history, not just through the natural progression. Now, we're going to get through all different forms of Florida's history, but um, we're initially going to start with some of the natural history. Okay, so let's go through a clear discussion of what we're going to cover today. We're going to discuss the fate of water, and then we're going to talk about Florida's first settlers, and then we are also going to talk about the Florida frontier. So don't mind me if I'm looking back and forth. I just want to make sure I'm respecting your time, and my phone is behind me. So I just want to check our time. So if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. Now, this is one of my favorite lines by Michael Crichton, and we can walk through a forest and we can enjoy it and we can love it and it can be life-giving. But at the end of the day, we really, really want to make sure that we're understanding where it came from because it only enriches the experience of enjoying the nature of Florida and enjoying all of the different facets and how they interplay with the culture. It's just fascinating. One of my favorite instances of this was we were walking through a forest with an agent named Jim Davis. He's based out of Sumter County, and he does nature walks. And if you ever get the chance, you should definitely go through there because he is just a slew of information. Um, but we were walking through the forest, and he was showing us around this little preserve out in Sumter County, and we're talking about the cypress trees, and I'm like, oh, I just love the cypress trees. I wonder if anybody's really ever built much out of it. And he's like, well, of course, you build these cypress, you can take these cypress trees, and because they're sitting in the water and they have this certain capability to repel water, um, they made perfect canoes. And so you could actually take these canoes and you could take a cypress, build a canoe out of it, and you could actually set that canoe on the side of a river. For a long time, it could take lots of rain and it could actually take some of the tidal patterns too, and it would still be buoyant because that is how the cypress work. And it was resistant to many different pest populations because of its natural function within the ecosystem. So these natural ecosystems shape the anthropology of how we grow and just how these settlements were built. And it's just a really wonderful and enriching experience to know the history of where we're going. So I just love starting with that quote. Now, to really know Florida, we got to know the very basic thing that you learned in elementary school, and that is going to be the water cycle. So the water cycle has its standard pattern, which is condensation, precipitation, runoff, heat, evaporation. And this rhythm right here creates our habitats. So in Florida, we are known for our precipitation. We are known for how much water is hitting the land and how it's running off. And so one of the most important things that we talk about, in FFL is what is your water runoff? How are you mitigating runoff? Where is your water runoff going off of your property? And the reason why is because we have this water cycle that is consistently dropping water over our land, and we are getting this flow of water through um, each step of the way. So we need to figure out where it's going, and in some ways, we are actually required to steward that. Many of the famous creeks and streams that are throughout Orlando, my home city that I grew up in, are now completely underground. So they have been maintained, but they are run through underground pipeways now. So maybe the ecological factor is not there per se. You don't have just this creek that runs through the city that is covered with all sorts of different kinds of plant species, but people have recognize the importance of those water, different water bodies and the way that they are collecting water in the watersheds, and they are rerouting them to be able to move to the same water bodies that they once were, but they need to be able to create infrastructure and roads and have houses. So eventually they get moved to these underground systems. So although we don't see them, they are certainly not being neglected outright. And so this water cycle creates this rhythm over the land, and we constantly have water. We have the hurricane season, which often brings in a big influx of water as well. So we go step by step through the cycle, and you can begin to see a pattern. So we have this wet season and the dry season, and our wetlands love to depict these these shifts in the season. So um, a major one here is lily pads. They have these, they have a stem and they're buoyant, and yet they will move with the water line up and down because they know that they're going to catch these different rhythms throughout the year. And we also have the dry season as well. You can see these cypress trees, and many people speculate on what the cypress knees that come up from the ground do, particularly. Some say it's aeration of roots. Some say that it could be something else. But at the end of the day, what they do show you is the water line. You can see, based on these cypress knees, you can see the different water lines throughout the different seasons. So it is really, really wonderful to see that as you walk through our wetlands, you can start to see this rhythm of water that's coming through. There are dry seasons and there are wet seasons, and there are times where we recharge the aquifer, which we'll talk about, and there are times at which we are kind of just a dry area. There are some wetlands that are dry for a good period of time until they are wet again, and it's just based on the yearly rainfall. So I just want to make sure that my sound is going to be good, and I feel like my video might be taking up. So I'm actually going to drop my video just to ensure that I'm getting a better bandwidth with my internet and you guys are getting quality sound. So um, with that being said, let's move on to the next point. So water has this fate. So we have an excess of water throughout Florida, and how is it being used? Well, one of them is going to be through these watersheds, these rivers that are moving throughout our land, which are basically just low-lying areas um, that collect water and move it along in a different pathway. Now, these can be propelled by different kinds of springs, which we'll get into, but the main point of what I'm trying to say is that these rivers will move through the landscape, and they aren't clear-cut lines like we like to look at on a map. They're not like a road per se. They have floodplains which flood out on the banks of these rivers, which are basically like a margin of error for our rivers. And what happens is when we look at these margins of error, we kind of start to get these wetland systems building up on the sides of our rivers because they're sometimes getting flooded with water and sometimes they're not. So we have the definition of what a wetland is, which is these ecosystems that are saturated with water that can drain periodically. So a floodplain is a really rudimentary way of looking at a wetland, although wetlands can flood and drain for all different kinds of reasons, one of them being on the riverbanks. And then we have the aquifer, which is one of the key, most interesting parts of Florida. I feel like if anybody visits Florida, they should take just a class on the aquifer because it is how we get all of our drinking water. Um, and I mean, outside of a very small percentage of it, but we get most all of our drinking water out of the aquifer. And the aquifer is a porous limestone rock beneath the ground that holds water. So we have loads of calcium carbonate underneath our feet in Florida. And what that is it's a structure that's high in calcium, and it is the best way I like to explain it is the same way that when you look at a sponge and you look at a sponge and a sponge has all those holes throughout it and it holds water. It's very similar to what we stand on with our aquifer. Now, the aquifer is not as pliable as a typical sponge would be, but it certainly it holds in a lot of water underneath us, and we can tap that for more water using a well, or we can recharge it by finding different points along wetlands. Wetlands typically have a point where they discharge the water beneath the ground into the aquifer. So we have all different ways of filling up the aquifer that is beneath us, and the aquifer has essentially holds a lot of the water that we drink, and it has different times that it discharges amounts of water. Sometimes water that feeds through a wetland can be traced, and it comes out 30 years later from the aquifer. Some water comes out several months later. It really depends on how and where the wetland and the recharge point from the wetland is located in order to help cycle more water down into the aquifer. So, with that being said, we have a watershed. So this, you may have already heard me talk about this during the presentation, but the watershed is a low point where water will naturally accumulate. And then what happens is when you have water accumulating, water loves to grab on to all different kinds of nutrients, and it loves to basically foster a community for biodiversity. So that biodiversity is going to be a key point of a wetland, is that because the water is bringing nutrients, it's bringing basically the essentials for life for plants, which can basically conglomerate more nutrients. And as plants conglomerate more nutrients, other animals can come and eat them. I believe this is a picture of Payne's Prairie Preserve out in Gainesville, where you have this point where you can see that you have animals grazing, wild horses grazing out on this kind of prairie area that does fill up at times and become more of a wetland style area because it's just a sink for all sorts of nutrients and water, which are the basis for life. You get a lot of sunlight too in that area, and you are ready to go for just a really, really diverse hotspot. And again, like I said, we have the recharge points. So these are hydro periods, basically determine how slowly water drains in the aquifer. So we can have all sorts of types of wetlands. Some wetlands have a very small hydro period, which basically means some will, when it rains, they will fill up and it will look all wet and it will almost look like a lake. And then, it could be very quickly, within a few weeks, it could be completely drained out. And it could just look like a normal plot of land that might be a little damp, as opposed to some have a much longer period that will fill up, and it takes a long time for that water to discharge back into the aquifer from the wetlands. So you will find that some wetlands stay wet and some wetlands are still considered wetlands, but they're pretty dry. And during the dry season, they stay pretty dry. So wetlands being a factor of Florida and being a very integral piece to Florida take on a, a very different forms throughout the state. And really, just honestly, geologically, you could have two vastly different operating wetlands within, a couple 100-mile span of each other. So it's it really is a case by case, but they do have these similarities. They are a watershed. They do have a diverse ecosystem and they have a recharge point. If they didn't release their water at some point in time, they would just continue to conglomerate water and become a lake. So they do have these key points of being wetlands. So here's just a great picture of our aquifer, and so it spans over 100,000 square miles and provides water to 90% of Floridians. We have the superficial aquifer system, which is all throughout the state of Florida, which is that bluish teal color. And there's some pretty cool geological things that go on with the aquifer. One of my favorites you can actually find in Gainesville. There is a rift up in Alachua County. And what happens is if you go to this rift, it jumps about 40 to 50 feet. In some areas, it's much more drastic, but it jumps about 40 to 50 feet very quickly in elevation. And that doesn't seem like a whole lot. But what happens is the armpit of Florida is really, really a hot spot for getting a lot of rain. And so rain comes across here, it drops a lot of water, and then what it does is it hits these wetlands. These wetlands recharge the aquifer, but then the aquifer decreases, the altitude of the aquifer decreases once you get across this rift that's around Alachua County. And what you get is that the water follows the path of least resistance. It drops down below this rift and it begins to increase water pressure. So around this rift and around Central Florida area, that's why you get so many high-powered springs. These specific springs are called first magnitude springs. Now, these springs are often associated with wetlands in Florida, and it's pretty crazy. So a first magnitude spring pushes out over 100 cubic feet of water per second. Just think about that. That's not just like just 100 cubic feet. It just has to be over 100 cubic feet. So some could be pushing out a lot more. So every second of every day, it is just dumping hundreds of cubic feet of water per second into that is how much water we're dealing with in Florida. Um, and so we have 33 of these first magnitude springs in Florida. So that's that's just astounding to me to think that every second that I spend, there is at least 3,300 gallons of water pumping out of Florida's aquifer. That is the magnitude at which we are dealing with these ecosystems and ecosystems and wetlands recharging our aquifer and how much it's being pumped out. So it's not just like small numbers here and there. It's a lot of water entering this aquifer. And let alone, that's 33 first magnitude springs. We have loads of other springs that may not push out 100 cubic feet per second, but are still putting out a lot. So we are easily dumping so much water back into our land, and it's just kind of a recirculating system. And the cool part about our aquifer is that it does clean the water to some extent. Now, there are some studies that show that not all the water gets completely clean depending on what kind of chemicals are in there, but I am not a hydrologist, so I will not, you know, step too far in that zone. But I will say that for the most part, it does a great job of cleaning. That's why we can drink spring water. Now, other things love to drink spring water too, and it is a wonderful place because you have all of these wetlands. And they're getting this fresh, wonderful water coming out of the ground. And you start to see some of these animals that are really influenced by the way that the wetlands are acting with the aquifer and with the springs. And as you can kind of see, it's kind of the system that all starts to work together as one. Manatees are a great one. You can see a lot of manatees enjoying fresh water around the springs, and they're also typically eating a lot of the plants that show up in the area. And raccoons are very common. They hunt and fish around there because it's a great food source. You have lots of plants. One of my favorites, though, is the apple snail. So they are just kind of foragers all around wetlands. And then, so you'll find these guys. And a lot of times, I always grew up, I don't know if it's the same with you guys, but I always grew up with these little pink eggs all over all over docks and all over plants. And people always would tell me that they were frog eggs. In this case, these are snail eggs. So the snail eggs are actually quite toxic, but in some cases, depending on the snail species. But the apple snail is a huge source of food found throughout wetlands. Because they forage and because they eat on all sorts of different plants, they're really not that selective. They end up becoming this kind of they'll collect a lot of the nutrients, the stuff that everything else doesn't eat, and then other things eat those, and then it goes right back into the system again. So one of those fun ones is snail kites, and there's a pretty fascinating story that these snail kites they'll just snatch a snail off, and they have a beak that is formed that can actually make its way perfectly into the shell of the snail and pop that sucker out. There was actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was an invasive species of snail that showed up and in a wetland in Central Florida. And what happened was the snail kites started to lose their original food source, but there was actually a true case of watching the snail kite's beak form change over time to adapt to this new invasive species of snail to be able to hunt those. So it was really, really interesting. Um, I don't know if any of you guys are into birding, but I love birds. I love, if you guys have ever played the board game Wingspan, it's a pretty amazing game. If you're not into birding, it's what got me into birding. Um, but the point of that is that I really have come to love the biodiversity of bird populations throughout Florida. And you can begin to see how they play into this story as well through their migratory patterns and their feeding patterns. So just a really, really wonderful um, uh, way to enjoy nature and to see. The local wetlands that I have near me in Orlando is called Orlando Wetlands Park. I think I have a picture of it actually. They have a huge wood stork population, which people have their thoughts about, how cute wood storks are, but they are magnificent species. And when you get to see them up close in a basically a cypress forest, building massive nests in the trees. I mean, it is just wonderful, just to be able to get to see them do their thing up close, and the wetlands provided there, which is actually an artificial wetlands, um, really does have an effect on the populations, and they cater to all these different bird species. So I know we talked about some of our favorite wetlands. I think probably many of you in the chat do have do have your special spot that probably it does a much better job than the ones I'm putting up here. But I will tell you some of my favorite that have had some of the biggest effects on my life have been Orlando Wetlands Park. It's a wonderful one. My whole family loves to go, so I take them very often. They do, if you go on a Saturday, they will actually do a golf cart tour for you, and it's all free, and you just can tip the volunteers, and they will take you around the park for an hour and just show you around. It's wonderful. You can go any time of the year, but I like to go around this time of year, and there are gators everywhere. Um, and so if you hop in these golf carts, they don't really bother you at all. They wouldn't bother you really on the walking trail either, but um, the other one that I love is, I mean, the Florida Everglades. If you have the time and you have the energy and you can plan a good trip to go out to the Everglades, I mean, that is just just the poster child for great wetlands and diverse ecosystems. There's nowhere else where you can go out there and go fish and catch a tarpon in one portion and then go inland a little bit and catch a freshwater bass. So it is just so diverse, and it's because you get this meeting of freshwater and saltwater, and it just is really a wonderful place. Now, you definitely want to go during the colder seasons because even then it's going to be buggy. But if you get out there during the summer, you better have some really, really high level bug repellent. Um, the other place I want to talk about is Highland Hammock State Park. If you've never been there, it's wonderful. It's great for trail hiking. You can walk through all different kinds of Florida staple ecosystems, including pine flatwoods, and then you get into some kind of hardwood forest, but then you can dive straight into wetlands, and it's a really good example of an area with just diverse ecosystems and how the wetlands play into all parts of that ecosystem. Okay, with that being said, we've really covered a lot of the environmental side of these ecosystems of wetlands and Florida and some of the natural side. And now I want to get into some of the way it's been affected by man and the way that we have settled. So I like to put that here that the first settlers were also snowbirds. And so the why did people end up here? Well, we can't just ask them questions, but based on what the Orange County Regional History Center had to say, they said that around 15,000 BC, we can't really peg it perfectly, the northern mammoth begins to seek refuge into Florida. Now, around 12,000 BC, there are spear tips found from natives going to Florida for mammoths. So now the people hunting mammoths for their major food source are starting to follow them down to Florida because Florida is becoming um, a place that is uh, more habitable by this species of mammoth. Now, fast forward, we find that this area becomes more and more habitable because of these rising sea levels, allowing for more shellfish. Now, Florida's always been a major shellfish area. I mean, a lot of the calcium carbonate we have from our limestone is actually limestone based on some of this shellfish that is built up over time. Um, so we have all of these shell mounds starting to show up that it's what it begins to show us is that this becomes a major food point, is that collecting these shellfish from all of these inland saltwater streams that are coming through, uh, that this is what's kind of sustaining these populations of humans in Florida. Now, because it's so good, they eventually begin to just wander a little bit less and fish a little bit more, which is wonderful. So this is what I was saying was many of us do come down here on a fishing trip and we're like, hey, this place is pretty great. Why don't we just stick around? And that is exactly what the first people who came here did. So don't feel like you're some outsider. This is where everybody came from, was for good fishing and good weather. And that's why I like to ask the question, why did you come to Florida? So it's, we all come here for different reasons, but many, many people state that it is certainly the weather number one. And then the fishing and food and all of that is just wonderful here. So just to do a quick jump of, about 4,500 years, that the, shellfish, these are, you can see in this left picture here, this is a shellfish mound of how many they ate. And they're wonderful spots for, just archaeology. It's basically trash piles. So we can see everything that was being made. What's crazy is we start to see their pottery and the way they're building things. They start to incorporate Spanish moss into their pottery because it actually stabilized a lot of the pottery, almost like rebar and cement works. Yeah, so a lot of the pottery that we see throughout Florida is actually starting to adapt a lot of the Floridian species as well. So it's just really cool to see how many of the first Native Americans came to these areas and began to just build with such level of ingenuity by using what was available to them. So they're living on oysters and many kinds of other shellfish, but oysters are a big one. They're creating settlements. They have a little bit more stabilized food. And like I said, they've been using the cypress for canoes, for trade and hunting. So these inland rivers, which to some extent, back in the day were actually like a little bit more extensive, became perfect trade routes because you could just skirt through a lot of Florida, without having to deal with major trails or having to blaze trails. So, um, it really was a great place for trade and hunting. And so let's get one thing straight. When the Timucuan, which were the people who were there, the original kind of Native American settlers, their shell mounds revealed that plants were thought to be number one, but it's really hard to tell that because plants biodegrade pretty quickly and shells do not. But they did find the bones of all of these other animals, and so they did show that this was a really big portion of their diet, whether it be sharks or fish or manatee or gator or deer. These were all major protein sources for for the Timucuan. Now, with that being said, I think it's important to note that I believe that when I was talking to them, they said that although we always think of gator as being like, your backcountry, like this is what people used to eat, it actually didn't play as much of a role as we think it did. People didn't just hunt gator all the time to eat it, not at this period in time. Once we get further into the settlement, which is the Florida frontier. So this is something that really shaped the way Florida continued to progress. There was the Armed Occupation Act that basically promised anybody who came to Florida 160 acres, but they'd have to hold the land for 5 years. And it was a pretty hostile place. But that 160 acres is a lot of land in a very, relatively fertile area, great for cattle driving. So they would just kind of free range cattle, and that was actually where a specific form of uh, horse called the marsh tacky was bred to be able to handle a lot of Florida's marsh because you have a lot of wetland and marsh. So you have these special horses called marsh tackies, which a lot of the original cattle drivers had. that were specifically made for this area. Now, I think the like you they may still be around, but for the most part, people don't just breed marsh tackies as much anymore. Um, but they created just to think about the idea that they bred a specific kind of horse to handle these um, specifically these wetland environments is just fascinating. And then Florida Crackers also did a lot of moonshining. It wasn't a very policed area back in the day. So if you ever want a really great read, it is called South Moon Under. It is by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, who did The Yearling. It is a book that she wrote back in the day. It was one of her original pieces, like one of her first, about what Florida crackers did based on they were so driven by actually the phase of the moon based on what they were hunting and when they were moon shining and all of these things. And so she writes a book and it's about a settler who gets a basically moves into a palm flatwood kind of area and him and his family and just about living out there and it is a very well written book. And it's a huge chunk of Florida history, and it's actually kind of hard to find these days, but worth seeking out if you want to know more about how the actual environment really shaped the way people lived and hunted and even did things like moonshining. So worth checking out. They used to have a term back in the day called the Florida Frolic, and it was because game was so abundant back then that people would just frolic through the fields. They'd take their gun with them and they would just hunt and eat anything and everything. Whether that's rattlesnake, possum, bear, or a lot of frogs as well. They would make a chore of it and just enjoy hunting. So hunting was a huge part of Florida history. It still is. Hunting is one of the largest uh, actual benefactors to conservation itself. And so it needs to play an integral role in the way that we continue to steward Florida forward as well. So I just kind of want to end this off with now that we've looked at the natural history, the biological history, and the human history of Florida's wetlands and their stories. Um, I just want to leave you guys with the fact that you have a story too. You came here just like everybody else and every other species that also inhabits this area, and don't let people count you out if you're new. I kind of came into building this presentation being like, well, I'm a seventh generation Floridian, and I have the gusto and the ability to be able to talk more on the subject. But really, once I was done doing all the research, it really humbled me to sit and understand the fact that we all are very new to our environments and and that it's okay to be new to here because everybody came down here for good weather and good fishing and good hunting. So um, I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to your local extension. You can reach out to me. And you can always go visit your local history centers because they are awesome resources to talk to on these subjects. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Calvin. I think everyone really enjoyed that. That was really interesting. We have a bunch of questions. So let's get some easy ones to answer out of the way. What was the name of that historic facility owned by the county?
That is the Orange County Regional History Center.
Orange County Regional History Center. Awesome. And then can you tell us more about the symposium that you mentioned at the
Oh,
beginning?
yes. I can tell you a little bit about the symposium. The symposium is put on by the International Society of Horticultural Sciences and Echo Global Nursery, which is based out of Fort Myers, Florida. And essentially, if you want to know more on specifically underutilized crop species, which are just a fascinating topic in and of themselves, um, you can visit Echo Global Nursery. They have a whole publication section on all sorts of just crops that you would have never heard about. And they even sell a lot of the crops that they talk about, which is very interesting. You may need to be careful because some of the crops, at least from a university perspective, are invasive. So just be careful about what you're buying and knowing where you're putting it down and double check to make sure if you're purchasing that it isn't invasive. But yeah, fascinating. One quick fun fact about that. We have about 400,000, roughly 400,000 different plant species on the planet that we know of. About 30,000 of them are edible, about 10,000 have been cultivated, and about 350 of them are
Wow.
are really major cultivated. So we really have a huge span of plants that we can be either breeding to be more cultivated or to mess around with the other 10,000 that we don't particularly use these days. So it's a wide open book these days.
Cool. Okay, we have another hopefully pretty easy question to answer. What's the intermediate confining district composed of? I'm assuming that's the aquifer. No?
Oh,
Oh,
hmm.
the
Oh, well, let's get back to that picture really quick. Yeah, I actually don't know that exactly. I have, yeah, I'd have to look into that. And if you
it must be
shot me an
something that's
email, I could definitely check it
not
out.
not permeable, right? Like the confining, because you have the two, I don't know.
Yeah, like
I
it
would guess,
holds it in.
yeah,
It's yeah, that may be it.
might need to ask a geologist because that's not
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. I do more plants than I do rocks, but
There we go.
this is my one thing, you know?
Um, well, let's look at, so here we go. I live on a water canal close to Weedon Island. We have a lot of wildlife going through our canal, including dolphin pods, hunting and fishing, manatees, seabirds, etc. And some of our neighbors say we might have a spring in our canal, and how can you know that?
Hmm. Well, if I considered if there was a spring, I would first check public records to see if there was anything on the maps, and maybe even your local water management district. And then also, there may be a way to be able to test if it's a brackish area and there was a spring there. There's a likelihood. Now, it's not like saying that not some springs push out a lot more salt water, but there's a likelihood that the brackish water, you could be able to tell the concentration of salt, um, based on where you're at. If there truly is a spring, there's a lot of times that you would know that. If you thought there was a spring there, I know some people that, there's high concentrations of fresh water in the Everglades. Some guys will buy a bunch of shrimp to go take on the boat, to go out fishing, live shrimp, and they'll turn on their live well, and then they'll boat out to where they're going to go and realize all the shrimp are dead because the water has way less salinity, because of its nature of being fresh water. So there are some telltale signs as well if the salinity is low. But then again, it could also just be pushing out a little bit more saltier water.
All right, we have a lot of questions. What was the name and the author of the book you mentioned?
I think it's Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Let me double check for you though. It's the same, the book The Yearling.
That
It's
if that's the same author, then yeah, that's
yeah.
Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. So Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings is the author, and do you remember the title?
And then it's called South Moon Under.
South Moon Under. Cool. Um, what was the book about Florida crackers?
Um, what was the what? I'm sorry, was that?
The book about Florida crackers.
Oh, that would be the same one. But if you want
Oh,
another
okay.
good one, what's the A Land Remembered is like a classic one too. Um, so there's loads of books on Florida Cracker. Sadly, they just don't hit the mainstream all that often. But that is another big one that people like to read. But anything by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings is basically just like early Florida culture. Well, as early as we think it is.
We have another aquifer question we may or may not be able to answer. What is the superficial aquifer system and how is it different than the other types?
So when I teach a rain barrels class and we talk sometimes about superficial aquifers. There is a certain level of the aquifer that doesn't actually tap into the main line of it, and that's where you see a lot of shallow wells happening. In this case, the superficial aquifer is here, but there's also there's a true aquifer. But and it so like from some of the presentations I do, there is like a layer that doesn't make it to the core, but it's holding a lot of water and it's made it past, just ground level. So it kind of depends, I guess, on the situation. But that's what I know.
I have a couple questions about spraying. So FWC does a lot of spraying, and a lot of communities do a lot of spraying in wetland areas. So one commenter wanted to know, how does this affect water quality and the health of wildlife?
Mm, I am not a natural resources agent, so I
Okay,
don't know if am I particularly qualified to answer that
right.
one.
This is
I
something
would
that
check with, I think yeah.
I was either probably you could ask your extension agent in your county to see what they have any insight into that, and then also yeah, I mean FWC is a good place to go for that too. Are you so? We also have someone who lives in an HOA and are trying to protect their waterfront, and their HOA also does chemical sprays. Do we have any advice for this resident living in an HOA?
Well, Florida Friendly Landscaping does have one of the better suggestions, like one of the ones that I love, which is the 15-foot buffer zone
Hmm.
away from shorelines. Um, that is one way, and I know that the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program has a lot of very easy plug and play kind of ways to get their principles into HOA documents. So it's
Right,
worth kind of isolating that or finding it through our Florida Friendly Landscaping website, um, and then working with your local HOA to be able to get that written into the laws of your HOA and to be able, because that buffer zone really, I mean, it really can help. I mean, it's nice to have a zone where nothing's being sprayed or fertilized or really even mowed. Um,
right.
in that zone. So that's at least that I can think of first thing off the top of my head.
One of the things that we recommend, Alessandra, is getting in touch with your HOA board, whether that is speaking to members of the board. You might have a landscaping committee, you might have a ponds management committee, or it might just be the normal board. And so if that's something that you're passionate about, talking to them first. And then if you need backup, you can always say, invite your local extension agent to do a presentation or give some information to your board. And like Calvin said, we do have documents that you can just plug in into your codes, covenants, and restrictions. That's sometimes a little harder because you have to get that. A lawyer has to submit that to the state, but what you can do is you can change your architectural review standards. So if you have an architectural review board, that's something that you can change those standards, and that does not need a lawyer, and it's much less expensive to get those changed. So my first step would be talk to your board. My second step would be contact your local county extension agent to see if they are willing to do a presentation or willing to talk with your board, and then look at our website. I'm going to put the link in the chat in a second to look at some of these documents that we do have that you can use in your HOA. Okay, here's one. Can you name some nice springs in the Orlando area?
I feel like Wekiva and Rock Springs are typically the two major ones that people are
Yeah,
going to.
I would say, yeah, there's also DeLeon Springs, that's pretty near. And there's a bunch in the Gainesville area. So if you ever want to make a trip up to Gainesville, oh, Ocala, also Ocala National Forest has a ton. My favorite
Yeah.
spring actually is Silver Glen Spring, and that is in the Ocala National Forest. And oh, what's the other one? Oh yeah, Juniper Springs in Ocala National Forest is also really
Yeah,
gorgeous.
those are both awesome.
So yeah, Wekiva and Rock Spring are the closest to Orlando. Okay, well, let's look here. We just had a lot of book questions. Okay, just so we know, we have some other book suggestions in the chat here. A Land Remembered is fact, is historical fiction with a wonderful overview about how Florida got settled. Um, and someone also recommended the Master Naturalist program for anybody who's interested in following up with this. We have another question here. Do new lagoon communities threaten the aquifer levels in Hernando County? Do you have any idea about that, Calvin?
Mm, I don't really know. I mean that comes a lot down to building code and specific county Some I'm sure do a good job at it and some may not. So I think that would be something you'd have to check with the developer on.
Yeah. Um, and here's another, we'll see if we can just answer this one too. Do you have any recommendations for getting some help for a declining seasonal pond due to excessive nutrient runoff?
Hmm.
Because I know
Nothing.
there's a lot of seasonal ponds, and it kind of just depends on the water levels, and that fluctuates throughout the year. It also fluctuates depending on water withdrawal. I'm not sure if that is affected by nutrient runoff. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that it is a bit of a case by case on what it looks like and where those nutrients are coming from, and and if those nutrients can be mitigated before they make it there, um, or if there's enough room to do, bioremediation. I think there's a lot of factors that play into how that works.
Cool. All right, we have a couple other springs suggestions for Orlando area, Rainbow Springs and Blue Spring State Park. That's the one. I think it's in Orange City, so that's pretty close to Orlando as well. Well, I'd like to
Yeah.
thank you, Calvin, for your presentation today. It was really interesting, really pretty different from what we usually have on our webinars, and it was really cool. And thank you everyone who attended, and we will see you at our next webinar.
Thank you guys.